Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for, hey, Leo. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm just going to introduce myself here as I'm getting started. My name's Kevin King, and I'm a typeface designer at Typotheque, which is a type foundry based in The Hague, the Netherlands. But I'm based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I'm really excited and honored to have been invited to speak at this incredible conference and such an important conference. And I'd like to share a little bit about the work that I've been doing and that I'm continuing to do with Indigenous communities in Canada. And first, I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. So as I mentioned, I live and work in the city of Toronto, or Toronto, and which is the traditional territory, of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat peoples in the traditional territory of Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Today, the city is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Okay, so in my talk today, I want to share with you some of the work that I'm doing at Typotheque, currently working in collaboration with Indigenous communities, and to just describe to you a little bit about the process of how I go about undertaking my work as a settler person, having grown up in Ontario, Canada, and how do I engage in a respectful way through building relationships within Indigenous communities, language keepers, in order to develop language tools for the communities. And what I wanted to focus on, which is really what the motivation for my work focuses on a lot, and that is Indigenous language revitalization. So as a settler person in Canada, reconciliation and the process of reconciliation is incredibly important to me, just as a citizen. And in my work as a typeface designer, I want to always be learning and finding a way to engage with Indigenous communities so that I can contribute in a positive and meaningful and respectful way to this process of reconciliation. And so with my skills, I come at it from the angle of supporting the revitalization of language and its preservation through my skills as a typeface designer. And I thought a good way to start talking to begin my talk was to discuss a little bit about barriers that Indigenous communities in Canada face towards revitalization, some ways we might think about that. And then in the second part, to show you how we worked in collaboration with the Naturally community in particular in Western Nunavut. A lot of you might be aware that we released the Typotheque Syllabics project last January. And that was a process of 2 years of research and collaboration with the Naturally and other Indigenous communities in Canada on the syllabics writing system. But I wanted to show you a little bit about more about how we work with the communities, or how I approached building trust and engagement, and how we arrived at the final solutions. And so I think that just thinking from a typographic perspective and an orthographic, let's say linguistic perspective, that the Indigenous languages across Canada have there's such a rich graphic diversity, both in the syllabics writing systems that are used across those communities that choose and identify with using syllabics for their writing, and also in the various Roman orthographies that might be quite highly complex in their text processing requirements. But one thing that I've learned in my experience building relationships and working with local communities is that the way in which the language is written, it's not just important to communities from the perspective of, let's say it's a good way to write the language, but also from a cultural perspective, is really important to the identity for the communities. For instance, to be able to write in syllabics, to be able to write with an orthography that can actually accurately represent your syllabics, or like in the Carrier Dacoth community in central British Columbia, having your syllabics be represented graphically in the way that you identify with them. And so, for example, the writing systems, and as you've seen in many other examples of work that have been shown on just a general cultural level, the writing system has a place where it's being used in the communities, and it's an ingrained part of identity. And this is something that I've learned from language keepers and elders that I've worked from and gotten a sense of the importance. In the Dacoth community in British Columbia, it was a critical way of writing, and the community would use it to print, for instance, a newspaper that was distributed in the late 19th century, but also for memorial markers, trail markers on trading routes. So this, for instance, the syllabics writing system was an important cultural identity marker that went beyond just something that was used for language. And so one thing that we worked on when we were working on the syllabics project was trying to identify technical barriers, which is really one of the major issues that a community will face at a baseline level. So if you don't have all of the characters that your orthography needs encoded in the Unicode standard, it's going to be very hard to engage with the community at large in a language revitalization and preservation program, because although you could have temporary solutions to compose texts and to do some of the work, you can't have reliable text interchange in digital spaces, and it makes it very difficult, especially for the youth, to become engaged in a way where you can. And also, people should be able to use their language in everyday situations. I think that's just a fundamental right for people. So one thing, when we released the syllabics, this tweet that I put out to thank the language keepers that I've been working with and that we continue to work with, was even Achima and Elizabeth Hidlari still couldn't render their name, let's say, in a tweet. They're still missing those characters, and that's because, of course, when you go from a Unicode proposal to trying to get to an end goal of having widespread availability and support for your characters that were encoded, it doesn't just happen very quickly. So part of my job is building realistic expectations. But other communities, Indigenous communities across Canada and North America, I'm sure, face a lot of these technical issues where there might not be a good excuse for a technical barrier, for example, such as this one. There are typefaces that indeed can render this diacritic composition that's required for Denishiline language. This is a CBC article, and for those not familiar, the CBC is a major news source across Canada, the national news source. And if they want to be a part of a process of reconciliation, I think it's part of their responsibility to ensure that the writing system is represented even orthographically in a way that it can be read, such as the orange example you see on the bottom. Or, for instance, you can read many articles that have been published even in the past year or two for First Nations communities that they can't get a government identification because the system that the government is using doesn't support the particular code points or the text rendering requirements that they need to render their name accurately. So, for instance, being able to compose a diacritic sequence, such as this in glyph composition. And there might be different ways as well, where I'll talk about also local preferences, which were important as a part of the talk. And part of the work that I've been doing is trying to understand what are local typographic preferences and trying to understand how we can support that in a type design space where there's a realistic We're doing it in a way that's both accommodating the way that the communities identify with their writing system, but also making sure that we convey realistic expectations as well of what is possible at the moment and what might be something we have to, maybe we need a temporary solution. So there might be different ways in which communities encode a text, and this is something both in Roman orthographies and syllabics that myself as a type designer making tools would have to be aware of. Some communities might encode with 2 glyphs to create a sequence, and others might encode with a single character that's available. Both are available, all are available in Unicode. But of course, it's a major barrier if you simply don't have your characters, as I was mentioning. So for instance, some communities might have either temporary solutions that aren't perfect, but allow them to have, let's say, capital letters. But they might not even have all of their characters still encoded into Unicode. And so there's still work to be done in this area. And in terms of local typographic preferences, that was something that that we were doing with both communities, or all the communities we worked with in the syllabics, and looking at things such as the local typographic preferences across different communities. So for instance, Nunavik community in northern Quebec will render the same character, the exact same character in terms of orthographic value that's rendered in Nunavut with a different shape. And it's something that's important and it's important for how Nunavik Inuktitut readers would identify with their syllabics, and then vice versa in Nunavut. And perhaps it's a good example to think about these local preferences in regards to something like the Cyrillic script, where there's a general way to render the Cyrillic script, so a standardized way. But in Bulgaria, for example, in the bottom example that you see here, there are local variations that are preferred for these same forms that you see above. And it's important to the way that the local community identifies with their writing system and overall with their language. Whereas in a slightly different scenario that's a little bit different than the Nunavik or Nunavut is that, for instance, in the Latin script, I can see a double story lowercase a and a single story a or g in the same context. And this character is the same character in the orthography. There's no particular local preference. People would accept either or character. There might just be different stylistic reasons to use it. But in Nunavik, for example, or Nunavut, it's very important to have that particular character rendered, although it's also important to make aware to the communities that we can build you a local custom tool font where you can use it on a local level, but in general text situations, the characters might appear in a way that is not exactly your preference. And so to contrast that, the work that we did with the Dakoth community in central British Columbia, though, the characters were just plainly incorrectly represented, starting from the work that was done by the original script encoding committee for the unified syllabics in Unicode. So those had to be changed because they were clearly not represented. And there may be local preferences as well in how you wish to have these shapes appear, like for instance, these diacritic marks. And what do we do as well as type designers when we're looking at solving decisions like this might be a general way on top for Silesian languages that would use the number 7 for a glottal stop? Do we design it as a lining 7 because that might be the code point that the community encodes the text as? Or do we want to develop a solution where the community might benefit from or prefer to use, let's say, an old style figure that is designed, or a character that's designed to work better with the lowercase? These are decisions that we have to make and weigh. And for me, making these decisions hinges on community outreach and working in collaboration with the community, and then finding a path forward. So you'll all be familiar with this project or you might be familiar with the project that we released last January, which was researching comprehensively the syllabics writing system and working close with the communities. And so conducting research both on technical barriers and local typographic preferences. And when you're working on a project like this, for myself, and I've mentioned, I'm returning to a point I made in previous presentations that I can't just begin by opening up a glyph set, and I can't do this really for any Indigenous language in Canada. I have to actually start working on a level of investigating the encoding and becoming familiar with how the communities both encode their texts. Are there technical barriers such as the Unicode level, the standards level, that need to be solved before I can actually build my glyph set and start drawing the font? So going to that level of work. Now, the way that we arrived at our solutions for this project was working in close collaboration with the community. And this was both in the Naturally community, which I'm going to give you an example and speak about the work that we did and continue to do. Partially, this was reaching out to them and understanding that there was a barrier of characters not being in Unicode, and then working through a process of getting those characters encoded, but also working with the Naturally community and other First Nations and Inuit communities in Canada that use syllabics to test the font or to test the syllabics typefaces throughout the duration of the project or the development of the fonts. So getting feedback as we went. So for instance, working with Francois Prince, a Dakoth language keeper in Fort St. James, and he was explaining in great detail the way that the Dakoth syllabic should work and how they should appear. And also building a system, a browser-based system, where we didn't have to travel because all this work was done during the pandemic. So there's lockdowns all the time. So we couldn't have traveled even if we wanted to, but also it wouldn't have been very efficient to travel either. So building a browser-based platform that got away from having to we got around issues of encoding. So various keyboards and input sources that communities might have by building an input source directly as the syllabics chart onto the browser page, and then having the different fonts in the browser for the communities to test. And we go through a feedback cycle of the communities could input their text, they could copy paste text as well if they wished, and it was Unicode compliant, testing the fonts, getting feedback, and then uploading new versions of the fonts and getting more feedback. So going through this cycle, and also working with them to develop different stylistic variations in syllabics to expand the typographic palette, and trying to understand if this was something that was needed or not. And what we did find is that, in fact, a contrast model was quite desired, and a cursive style has been actually quite well received to expand the typographic palette. And now we continue to work with the Naturally community in two respects. We continue to work with them now that the fonts are getting used in the community more to gather some wider spread local typographic preferences, such as, let's say, the difference between the two orange glyphs that you see in the sample on the left and the right, and seeing the standard version of this character, the th series, on the left that's used in Anishinaabe-Moan, in various Nehiyawin languages, in Dene syllabics, and on the right in Naturalingmutut, they would prefer this character. And we're working on trying to understand if this is something that's important for readability. And looking at the preferred size of the finals characters and getting feedback on that as well. Kerning is something that the syllabics have not tended to have at all. And what we did find in issuing text samples comparing the two is that overwhelmingly kerning actually improves readability dramatically in the syllabics writing system. And so that's something where we're working with the community to gather this feedback and continue to implement. and also looking at the preferred form of glottal stop in naturalique syllabics. And so to undertake this work, we're working with the language keepers who, for instance, develop these missing syllabics characters, so nilaula. And we're continually going through this feedback cycle, gathering feedback from the community, understanding what's a preference, where are there variations, and how do we proceed forward, and also helping them get third-party tools such as fonts and keyboards, making them available to the community so that they can get to a place where they can start working on their language revitalization programs and preservation, getting more youth engagement because they have Unicode-reliant tools, and they don't have to wait for how long it may take for major software providers to implement support on their level. So for instance, coding a keyboard and making it available to the community so that people can start using it actively. One of the great things in the community that we were also doing, and that was a great benefit, was Tiro Typeworks, John and Ross had built a custom version of the Euphemia typeface, which they refer to as 2.9.2. And it was something that used PUA code points, which was really great because it allows now for a fairly easy mapping of their old text and documents that were prepared during this period to the new code points that were accepted in Unicode. So what it results in is it results in tools that at this level of trying to help with revitalization and preservation, it also helps with self-determination for the communities to be able to use their writing system in a way that they identify with as, let's say, their syllabics, which is a way that was described to me by many language keepers, because it is something that they own, culturally speaking. And it's important to the community to be able to use their writing system in the way that they identify with it and to have access to tools to be able to do that. And so what we see now are materials that are being prepared in the fonts by the communities or different institutions, publishing companies that work with the communities with tools that were prepared through a process of collaboration directly with the community. So the syllabics reflect the way that they expect them to look. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to just quickly come back here and see. I don't know if I have time. Okay, so how much time do I have? I'm just trying to see. I think I might, well, I'll wait till they kick me off. Thank you very much, everyone. Now I'll see if I can have a quick, okay. So I see some questions here. Harant asked a good question. Okay, we'll take a quick minute. To answer Harant's question quickly, if everybody checks in the Q&A, so a balance between localized forms, we always have to be careful, I think, as people working in language support, so type designers, people who build keyboards and work on coding, we have to be careful to relay realistic expectations. So for instance, in the naturalique community, it was very exciting for the community back in October 2020 when the characters were accepted by the UTC, Unicode Technical Committee. But the community was thinking, oh, well, why can't we start using the syllabics on the cell phone and just widespread use? And of course, that's not possible because Unicode, first of all, when they accept characters, they only make a commitment that they will eventually publish them. And because of the pressing need for the naturalique community, it was published in the next release cycle. That was great. In terms of localization, though, we do have to think about how are we going to make that available to a general community in a way that's reliable. So open type features are something that can be even hard to get used by some graphic design settings. So local community members, we can't necessarily rely on the same implementations. So we look for ways of providing them either with a localized build. So for instance, in Nunavik, in the Nunavut community in northern Quebec, it's very normal to have a local build, a local version of a syllabics typeface that instead of using that Nunavut preferred form of the Angma character, that little character with the hook, it will be their preferred version. That code point will be represented or rendered in the way that they wish it to look. Okay. So to answer Dermot's question, we worked on the syllabics project for 2 years, and we continued working on this project and also working with other First Nations on the Roman orthographies now since then. But I continue to work with the Native and Dacoth communities very closely to help them with their revitalization work. And Neil's question really quick. We haven't had any luck at the moment. I will admit that we haven't looked too hard into this right now. I think what we've been focusing on in terms of syllabics and working with these communities is trying to get them, delivering them locally built tools or like a custom build that allows them to use the syllabics in their way, but also communicating to them to the fact that, for instance, the carrier community, the Dacoth community in central British Columbia would expect their syllabics to have finals rendered at the midpoint, but Unicode by default will represent and encode all of those characters on a general level at the top line. So what we can do is provide a local build or a custom version of the fonts that we would call the Dacoth November syllabics. And so we're able to do it that way at a local level, but and then at a general level, communicating to them that there will be some things that won't be represented exactly in this way. So at the moment, that's the best answer I can give for that part. But I think that's a great question that requires more investigation on my part as well. And Craig, never. So for myself, I'll go back actually to the start of the project. So I don't feel disappointed by the preferences expressed by the community. And I did work very closely, especially with Tamalik, who you saw in the movie and also in some of these clips, to work on the local typographic preferences in the naturally community. And what I tend to do is I sit back and I listen carefully and I try to understand what does the community have as a preference, because for me, it's not my place to give an opinion about an aesthetic preference, a style preference. But what I do say is that I'll make a comment where I'll say, well, this character might not behave very well in certain typographic environments, or there might be a variation needed on this in terms of an ideal version of this form so that it behaves better. So I give a typographic opinion and also giving a technical opinion too. But I don't ever weigh in on preferences, and I don't personally feel disappointed because I feel privileged, to be honest, to have the opportunity to work closely with the communities and participate in their language revitalization and preservation work. For me, that's really important for the community I live in here in Canada. And then are there some issues? Okay. Okay, are there some issues with rendering the characters and accents? And I think, yeah, InDesign is fine. And you do have to make sure that you're using the World Composer because you need the text rendering engine when you're, for instance, working on Silesian, Wakashan, or Athabascan orthographies. I think that professional design applications are fine, and of course, users can find general purpose typefaces for rendering email that are fine as well. But I think that for the most part, the Adobe apps are okay, and in terms of this rendering, yeah. But that's a good question. And there can be some issues in terms of local variation. Yeah, I think in that area. Okay, so I'm going to turn off my camera. Thank you, everybody. You can send me questions in Slack or feel free to email me. Bye-bye.